Good afternoon, and welcome to the third Guest of Honor event at Eikon, featuring our Guest of Honor, Charlie Stross. And he's a bit of a late arrival, but we're also going to have a surprise author at this panel, and I'll introduce him when he shows up. The people we do have on the stage right now are Karen Elazari, hacker, speaker, TED Talker.
How eloquent! Remind me again what you do for a living?
I publish and translate, and yeah. The words are hard, Karen. Words are hard.
They are, especially at this early time in the morning.
Yep. Yes. And of course, to my right is author Charlie Stross, our guest of honor. And we are going to be talking about the future of the future, which is a kind of vague term that means we're going to talk about how we view the future and how that has changed, and about near future SF, and all kinds of cool and exciting stuff like that. So my first question, which is mainly to Charlie and to Sam if he ever shows up, is science fiction even about the future?
Oh, loaded question. I'd argue it isn't. I'd argue it's political. An important point about the future is the future isn't what it used to be. If we go back 300 odd years to 1700 and the early 1700s, shall we stop and restart?
I'm so sorry, I just like attention.
Can you repeat that for the microphone, please?
I just like attention. No,
very good, very good.
Okay, this is our surprise guest, our not on the program guest, who until yesterday I did not know is even in the country. Sam J. Miller is a writer and community organizer. His work, his short fiction has appeared in Lightspeed magazine, Asimov, Clarkesworld, Apex, Strange Horizon, and others. He's got a book, YA, coming out, YA science fiction, next year by HarperCollins. He's been nominated for the Nebula, currently is nominated for the World Fantasy Award and the Theatre Surgeon Award, and has won the Shirley Jackson Award. And on his website, samjmiller.com. So yeah, the first question which I asked Charlie, and he started to answer, and we're going to also get to answer, is science fiction even about the future?
Okay, where was I? Go back 300 or 400 years, and everybody knew what the future looked like. The future looked like the present. Change was so slow that the odds were your lifestyle would be pretty similar to your grandparents' lifestyle. We also knew the shape of politics. It was generally run by a king or an emperor, occasionally an empress or queen, and they were there because God said they were in charge, and if you didn't agree with God, then they'd chop your head off. It's a fairly crude, basic model of politics where legitimacy was claimed on the basis of religious belief, but enforced by the sword. Now, then we hit the Enlightenment about 300 years ago, which arguably started out as a Protestant heresy based on part of Christian theology, the idea that Jesus was going to return and bring about the kingdom of heaven on earth. And the Protestants were very much, let's get our hands dirty and roll up our sleeves and make stuff happen. And they got this idea that, yeah, we should bring, God makes things happen for people who get off their arse and do it themselves. Let's bring about the kingdom of heaven on earth. Let's improve things. And they came up with this rather weird heretical view that things were happening and getting better, in that they pretty much invented the idea of progress out of whole cloth. Progress is very much a heretical religious view, and this sort of gathered pace during the 18th century, arguably culminating in the French Revolution. Politically, these days, the majority of people on Earth are the heirs of the French Jacobin society. We don't believe in the divine right of kings. We tend to believe in democracy. We tend to believe that human lives are of equal merit, or should have equal opportunity, at least. And we have this idea that things are getting better, that we are improving the lot of humanity on Earth, that tomorrow will be better than today overall. Now, science fiction is, to some extent, is almost entirely a literature infused with the Enlightenment mindset, the idea of progress. I would argue that it's also, to some extent, a side effect, at least in America, of a political movement that died, a modernist movement from the 1920s called the technocrats, who, there was this huge power vacuum after the First World War with the collapse of the monarchies and the collapse of the old system, and various new ideologies tried to move into the power vacuum. One of them was representative democracy, but two of the others we remember are fascism and communism. But there's another modernist, top-down, engineered worldview that sort of died. It was called the technocrats. And they had the idea that society should be organized and run by engineers. And if this doesn't remind you of John W. Campbell, I don't know what will. And, you know, technocracy has withered up and died, but the fiction that it inspired for Hugo Gernsback's magazines, and Gernsback was a technocrat, is still going. I occasionally do this rap about how, for an analogy, imagine if the Nazis had fizzled in the 1920s, but they spawned this subgenre of bizarre pulp fiction about two-fisted Aryan adventure stories in Tibet. This sort of kept on marching towards the future and was then picked up and reinvented by Jews like Robert Silverberg in the 1960s, and is totally divorced from its original political and ideological roots until you start examining its origins. And I should stop now, otherwise I'll run out of panel.
I have questions to Charlie. So,
we're answering the first question now.
what is this linear, you know, conservative view of time, really?
Panel is not a flat circle, Ken.
Well, let's make it one, really.
No,
Can I ask the question? Then let's let Charlie, the author, decide if he wants to respond or not. So you say that progress is this heretical concept, yes? Because perhaps in Christianity or the like, the idea is that moving forward is actually bad and it was better before, so that's why progress would be heretical? Did I confuse you?
It was heretical in the context of a previous Catholic model. Today it's pretty much universally accepted, but it wasn't always. That's the point I'm sort of making. I occasionally have these violent arguments in my email inbox with a guy called Mencius Moldbug, who's one of the authorities of the Dark Enlightenment, the neo-reactionaries. And he likes to point out that even today's regular conservatives are revolutionaries by the standards of the 18th century. This doesn't mean they're wrong. It just means that it's a change from the pre-existing worldview.
So there was a reason I asked this question, because I think whether we have to consider with science fiction, is it about the future at all? Which was the original question.
that was my question, yes.
And perhaps you'd like to say something about it. In a minute. Yes, in a minute, I'll get to you. So here's what I want to say about that. And I'm not a science fiction author yet, but perhaps in a multitude of futures I might be. And that's my point exactly. To me, science fiction has never been about a fixed point in time and then a forecasted future from that point in time. Science fiction can take place at any point in time, in the past, the present, a multitude of futures, and this perhaps linear idea of progress as a one-directional line, I think, honestly, is a very 20th century concept, and it's time to move away from that idea.
Can I agree violently?
Yes, you may, you may. Thank you. And now to you.
Hi. So, is science fiction about the future? For me, anyway, for what I write and what I like to read, science fiction is really about the present. It's about recent history. It's about the things that are happening now or have happened recently that maybe we can't talk about so objectively. Maybe they are about things like race and oppression, to which we are all very, we all have our feelings already, right? We already, the current conflicts that we're embroiled in, we already have our minds made up, or we think we know where we are with them. So being able to take them and look at them through a different lens and look at them as, well, maybe what if it was about aliens or robots or something totally different. I just finished writing a science fiction novel that sort of looks at, I've been thinking a lot and reading a lot about the AIDS crisis in America in the 1980s, and then the sort of like what it revealed about homophobia and racism and sort of the existing prejudices of American society, and how you know, it was a disease, but the society that it existed in made it play out a certain way so that it impacted some people but not others so much. And that's still, in many ways, a very difficult conversation to have. So I said it, you know, a couple hundred years in the future on a floating city after the oceans have risen, and now it's totally different. And now we can sort of, I hope, have conversations about it that are more objective and interesting.
My next question is, how do you think the way in which we look at the future have changed in recent years?
Well, I'm going to talk to written science fiction because that's what I know and that's what I do. And I've got to say, science fiction writers are regular people who live in the real world. And, well, funnily enough, and we tend to write about stuff that's going on around us, exactly what you said earlier, that we try and discuss current day issues, very often using the future as sort of a projection screen to project images on, and putting something outside the context of the present in the future or an alternate history or as fantasy gives us the distancing mechanism we need to examine an issue without getting emotionally wrapped up in our current response to it. Hang on, what was the question again?
How the ways in which we view the future have changed?
Yeah, well, the thing is, the way we view the future is informed by the present we're living through. The period from about 1920 to 1970 was dominated by a very optimistic view of transportation speed improving. You know, during that period, there were people who went from the horse and buggy through to high-speed cars and then airliners, and then watched spaceships taking off. I think it was Jack Williamson who was said famously to have gone on the Oregon Trail in an ox-drawn covered wagon and saw the Apollo 11 moon landing. That's an enormous acceleration in transportation speed, but actually was as significant in transport speed as the improvements in information processing tech that has happened between the 1960s and the present day, which coincided with our ability to move things, physical things faster, topping off because we ran into energy issues. It's kind of hard to go any faster than today's transport technology will allow us to do without going nuclear, and there are certain reasons for not doing that. Now, this means the nature of the future we were looking at in science fiction changed, and there was a shift in emphasis from expansion, exploration of space, physical expansion, galactic empires and so forth, a shift into informational futures. Consider cyberpunk as the example from the 1980s. Now, where we're going today, we're seeing more and more biotechnology, we're seeing more world SF written by people from other cultures who hitherto didn't actually have much of a voice or not much exposure to what we're reading. In what we're reading. We are beginning to see the first signs of acceleration in information processing slowing down. Molecular nanotechnology is out there and it's sort of spewed all over the world in fiction, much as giant big computers like Univac appeared in the 1950s. We're not actually yet living with the consequences of mature nanotechnology, so we haven't yet reached the cyberpunk equivalent for nanotechnology. Ditto biological engineering. But it's fairly obvious that this is where things will be going sooner rather than later. A lot of the writing is on the wall for the future. And there's a weird effect, though, that has been seen recently. First of all, Steve Jobs, co-founder of Apple Computer, Steve and Steve Wozniak apparently in the late 60s, early 70s dropped LSD and went to watch 2001: A Space Odyssey. And this had a permanent mind-altering effect on Steve Jobs. And if you've ever looked at original Macintosh sitting behind its keyboard, or later at an original iPad in the iPad keyboard dock, Steve Jobs all along was trying to create the black monolith. This is my favorite. He was looking for...
If I could just comment. Well, his computers and devices really do love to say, I'm sorry, I can't do that.
Okay, granted. But basically, Steve Jobs has been on a one-man quest for his whole life to try and invent the black monolith from 2001, which was a strange, implacable alien intrusion into the reality of proto-hominids that forcibly upgraded their consciousnesses, it's fairly clear this was what he was trying to do. And he isn't there anymore, but on a similar note, Elon Musk's plan to colonize Mars. This guy grew up reading Heinlein and taking him seriously. I'm not sure whether to laugh or cry.
I'd just like to sign up, basically. I think it's the appropriate response. Sign me up for the first bus to Mars.
I'm kind of old and cynical and have a lot of arguments against space colonization, but I think that's enough panel.
Fair enough. It would also be a one-way ticket, obviously. But I'd like to jump in and respond to the question.
That's not jumping in, it's your turn.
Then I don't want to do it. Okay, fight the power, yeah. So here's the thing. What I think science fiction used to be about, I think it used to be...
By the way, it's good, since you're a technology person, it's also useful to, the way that has affected looking at the future.
So, first of all, for me, personally, I wouldn't be here on this stage, I wouldn't be in my own line of work if it wasn't for cyberpunk fiction. So the works of fiction that I read, that I saw, the comic books that I love, they created my choice in my current professional present. So it definitely designs what we see of ourselves and in the future. I think that a lot of the science fiction of the 20th century was about our society, our economics, maybe our politics, whereas the science fiction of today, and particularly the stuff that Charlie was talking about, if you see these new issues of relatively new issues of nanotechnology and bioengineering, basically now I consider science fiction to be more about who we are and what we would like to be. And whereas in the past, science fiction described the society, even the most cutting-edge sci-fi authors were still mostly hetero, white men of English-speaking countries. Now we're seeing a multitude of voices and a multitude of people describing an utter new, perhaps new species, new types of human beings. I think the first time I read about something like this was actually in one of Charlie's works. So how many of you have read Aqs'elerando? Okay, fantastic. So you know what I'm talking about. In the beginning with Aqs'elerando, for me it was like, okay, cyberpunk, I get it, and there's this guy, this protagonist that's wired into the internet basically, and I could relate to that. But then in the second half, there's a whole new type of person and personhood that's created and imagined. And this is the sort of science fiction I think we're looking at now, that stuff that reimagines our society as a whole, including individuals and what it even means to be an individual in this world. Is that too philosophical for you all?
No, it's good.
Okay. No such thing. Okay. Rev up my philosophical engine then.
I think those are both really great points. For me, the thing that is the big change in how we view the future in science fiction now versus sort of in the past is, I think if you look at the quote-unquote golden age of science fiction, which sort of spans that 20s to 70s period, depending on who you ask, there is this incredible optimism. It's sort of this idea of we're all going to get jetpacks, and we're going to take this planet, and we're going to meet these aliens, and they might not be so nice, but we're definitely going to kill them all. So that's an oversimplification, of course, but there is this profound optimism. I just was at the Baltimore Book Festival, and I was watching a panel, and there was a man on the panel who was talking rather uncritically about the golden age, and Justina Ireland, who's a really talented writer of color, who was on the panel, was like, well, who was the 50s a golden age for, right? Because it wasn't a golden age for queer people or people of color. And so I think that what sort of changed is what you were sort of getting at, is that there are different voices now, and folks who whose experience of the world wasn't shaped by privilege, right? If you look at like the straight white boys who were writing so much of science fiction for so long, no offense to any straight white boys, it's it is this sort of like, it's very easy to be optimistic and think that the future is going to be amazing if your present and your past has been amazing. There's this sort of change in who's telling stories and what their experience of the world has been, so that we are seeing a future that is much more, I would argue, realistic in its depiction of what reality is now, and also sort of like, I think that it was a lot easier to be really optimistic about science and technology in the 50s versus now, when we have, the ocean levels are rising, and there's a lot of pollution, and things are just generally very bad. I mean, if you look at, I think, a lot of the science fiction that's getting a lot of attention, like the Wind-Up Girl by Pablo Bacigalupi, there's this sort of idea of the future is not going to be that great. You know, it might not be the zombie apocalypse, but it will be a apocalypse, right? And that's where we're heading, and that's where a lot of, I think that's the anxiety that a lot of us have that science fiction is now reflecting.
Yeah, I was going to add, if you peel back the red carpet that privilege stands on, you find a whole load of bones that have been shoveled under it. And if we look at some of that golden age science fiction, consider Asimov's Three Laws of Robotics. What Asimov was working on, you know, bright Jewish kid from the Bronx in the 1920s and 30s tries to rationalize a way of preventing a slave rebellion. His underlying metaphor for the robots in his robot stories in the 1930s was, these are basically black African-American slaves in lynch-ruled America under Jim Crow. The Three Laws of Robotics are sort of imposed on them to force them to be safe for the white folks who use them. Again,
the terrifying end of iRobot is that one of them becomes president.
Yeah, and then all of the alien invasion or alien war stories. You know, the aliens are just a simple placeholder for the alien, for other races, and we genocide them with total abandon and no consequences. Just once I'd have loved to have read a golden age science fiction story about a war between humans and aliens that results in a genocide, followed by a war crimes tribunal and some executions. Didn't happen.
Well, Andrew kind of felt bad.
Yeah, and part of it, I'd like to lay the grounds of John W. Campbell, who was a really odious, racist, sexist right-wing bigot, and who warped science fiction in America for decades. But I shouldn't rant about one particular guy or blame one particular guy. There's lots of blame to go round.
Following up on things you pretty much all said, and on something you said yesterday, answering questions in a panel, you said that there had been no major wave in science fiction for the last 30 years or so. Elizabeth, yeah, you said that. Yeah. Elizabeth Bear has, a few years ago, coined the current wave or age as the rainbow age of science fiction, which means that the wave is in fact the diversity you mentioned. Do you think that that categorization is true?
Yeah, actually, is this working?
No, it's going on.
Done it again. This microphone has done it again. I'm not going to shout. I'm just going to use this one. Yeah, she has a very strong point there. There's no way with the ideological coherency of the cyberpunks, with Bruce Sterling publishing manifestos as Vincent Omnia Veritas, or their faux opposition, the New Humanists, Kim Stanley Robinson. There's nothing even as coherent as the new space opera. What we do have is lower barriers to entry for diverse voices. The fact that there are things like a separate LGBT young adult SF field that's recognizably visible just wasn't around 20, 30 years ago. It's not a revolution throughout the genre in its own right. The revolution is the fact that such a small subfield can exist, along with numerous other small subfields. So yeah, I'll go with that.
I'd like to ask, what's the use of science fiction? I said I'd like to ask, what's the use of science fiction?
But I think before that, I think Sam may have relevant things to say about the current topic.
Okay, again, Didi, you were so adamant in sticking to the topic at hand.
I'm the worst.
You are. Okay, then I'll let you get to it.
No, I want to go to you. I want to answer your question.
You're so empowering. I appreciate it so much. So the point is, the point I'm trying to make, though, is that do we have, with the multitude of voices that we now have, with this amazing rainbow diversity, really does science fiction even need its own niche as a separate type of fiction? Why does it have to live as an endangered species in the zoo in a separate department of science fiction? Wouldn't it just be fiction, or perhaps speculative fiction?
Well, I can answer that. I'm a publisher. Marketing is the reason, is the answer to your question. More. I mean, there's also elements of community and other things, but the reason it exists as a niche is marketing.
So this need for distinguishing itself, science fiction needs to distinguish itself as a different species from other types of fiction to survive.
It certainly used to. Currently, you know, if you look at the bestsellers lists, and definitely if you look at TV ratings, and if you look at movie grosses, science fiction is the culture.
I agree with that, absolutely. So, for example, isn't the Hunger Games, vastly popular? Isn't it science fiction?
Of course it is.
Okay, so why the masquerade is what I'm asking, basically. Why, do you get what I'm saying, Sam? I feel like there's this...
Okay, Karen,
trying to be extraordinary when we don't have to be.
Give Sam the mic.
Okay. You have something to say? I think Sam can tell if you want.
I didn't, but now that I have it, it's feels so powerful. You know, I do think that there is a certain, my husband, wave husband, is here, and he was saying something about shame, right? And there is still this sort of stigma that's attached to science fiction, which is part of why it still gets sort of pushed into a corner. It's easier if it has a label on it; we can push it into the corner more easily. So I think that's real, and I think that these conversations are something that people have a lot in the community of, like, you know, is it science fiction? Is it fantasy? I'm not really sure, but I really like it. I think that's where people are at, the readers and the writers. The thing that gives me a lot of hope is I have a young adult novel coming out, and when it comes to young adult novels, these genre distinctions are not so important in merchandising, right? There's the young adult section of the bookstore, and young adults read everything, right? They don't care if it's in this box or in this box, and so you know, that's something that's very exciting. Is that, like, especially for young readers who are very passionate and voracious, those boxes are not so important, and so maybe generally those boxes are becoming less important.
I agree. Yeah, fair enough, Sam. Thank you.
Is this working? Is working again? Oh, miracle. Actually, yeah, the marketing thing. Go back to when books were sold only through bricks and mortar store. The whole idea of a genre was it lets readers find books that are filed with similar stuff. So you'd file your books under science fiction because it's easy to find other stuff that's similar to it. Now, a chunk of the ghettoization of SF goes back to the early 20th century in literature, certainly in the English-speaking world, where the literary mainstream took this bizarre turn away from the fantastic and insisted that everything has to be an accurate depiction of mundane reality. And this conceit sort of lasted for about 80 years, but it's sort of broken down in the past couple of decades. We're living in a world where human beings have trodden on another planet. We're living in a world where people are being killed by invisible flying killer robots on the orders of the United States President. We're living in a world where all of us have in our pockets a magic mirror that gives us access to the sum total of human knowledge, and we mostly use it for being angry at each other and sharing videos of cats. We're living in the science fiction future, not necessarily the one we thought we were going to get, but very much the cyberpunk future of the 1980s. And so it doesn't make a lot of sense to insist that science fictional tropes are excluded from the mainstream. The only reason it still persists is because most novelists are in middle age. They're not keeping up with new tech developments. You find any number of mainstream novels where the plot still works even if you take all the cell phones out. Who ordered that? You know, you can say that a science fiction novel is science fiction if it doesn't work as fiction if you take the spaceships or the time machine or the aliens out. And the same can be said of mainstream fiction. A lot of it is still stuck in the past, in the pre-cell phone era. Now, we're also, those of us who don't live in the pre-cell phone era, living in an age when we can get our hands on books electronically or on demand and search for new books, not by looking in the same shelves in the bookshop, but by electronic tagging. And this lets us have much, much finer granularity of search terms. So we can look for steampunk female protagonists of colour rather than J-random fantasy or science fiction novel. And we can actually get results for this sort of searching. And that in turn is also breaking down the utility of genre definitions like science fiction or fantasy.
I have a counterpoint to that, Charlie, which is, earlier you said that the authors imagined the future where, the technocrats imagined the future where engineers would us all So the reality of right now, the cyberpunk dystopian reality which has come true, is that engineers do rule us all. And the engineers that create the search engine algorithms that display the results when you look for a new featured book in Amazon or when you watch a show on Netflix, there are people, there are technology giants who design and control what we see and what we don't, what we choose and what we perhaps are never given the choice to. So that's perhaps even darker than we'd like to admit.
No, it's darker. It's venture capitalists who fund engineers who rule us all. And that's yeah.
And it's also idiots like Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook who believes that individuals have one true name and one social context only. You try telling that to a school teacher who wants to network with their friends, deal with their family, and has to present an entirely different face to the kids they teach.
Don't friend the kids you teach on Facebook is what I would tell teachers.
So the practical advice today, ladies and gentlemen, the science fiction panel is don't friend your kids.
On Facebook.
On
yes.
Facebook.
Yes, exactly. I like to point to two specific historical events that happened around the early 90s that I think had a large impact on the way science fiction views the future, and I'd be interested to hear your views on that. One is the rise of the internet, and the other is the fall.
Can you do that again?
The rise of the internet. And the other is the fall of the Soviet Union, which I think are you know, so much of science fiction leading up to that was about this big East-West conflict, directly or via metaphor, and technologically it was so much about going to space rather than going inside to information. And I'm interested in your views on how that has changed the way science fiction views the world.
Okay, I have to say, I kind of, maybe I missed it, but I missed the fact that science fiction was about this East-West conflict. Maybe that was one generation before me, or in some way.
Yeah, a young person.
True that, thank you. But perhaps a conflict between ideologies. Mm-hmm. So not just the East and West, but basically capitalism versus socialism and fascism and other isms and walks of life. So. Yeah, I don't think I'm qualified to answer this question.
The binary opposition thing? Well, I think the East-West conflict...
and the fear of the atom bomb.
Yeah,
and all
but in 300 years' time it's going to be laughable. You know, both communism and capitalism have this in common. They purported to be ideological basis for organizing an industrial society. When you get into a post-industrial age, or not technology-dominated age, or an information age, both of capitalism as practiced in the 1970s and 80s, never mind the 60s, and communism, are laughably obsolescent. It's like an argument between two different models of monarchism. Now, the internet and its rise is another matter. I spent a chunk of the 1990s insider.com. I suffered for it. And I think we made several hideous blunders in the computing revolution. And without getting too technical about it, about the third or fourth really huge blunder we went for was in the early days of the World Wide Web, not going for micro-billing as a model for paying content creators, but going for advertising. Advertising is basically the toxic swamp of the human subconscious, because it's there to steal our attention and get our attention and remove money from our pockets. And we embarked upon a race to the bottom. A few months ago, I discovered anecdotally, the front page of the New York Times, online, has maybe 2,000 words, or about 10 kilobytes of text on it. It loaded to 26 megabytes, which is about the size of Encyclopedia Britannica, almost all of which was dubious ad syndication network spam. And all of this is an attempt to monetize our eyeballs, to fund stuff, and it's having really weird, pernicious effects on our humanity's collective attention span and our interests. I think it was William Gibson who, around the time of Neuromancer, described the human id as being sort of like a monstrous 300-kilogram potato with one eye and one mouth, sitting on a sofa, gobbling handfuls of chips while soiling its underpants, holding a remote control aimed at a TV with 1,000 channels and screaming incoherently. And that's what I think of when I think about what the web is trying to turn us into. And it's not because it was designed to do that or because anyone wanted to do that, but it's an emergent property of a really stupid design decision made at the first World Wide Web Organization conference in 1995.
So advertising is the grey goo that's going to kill our own brain cells, basically.
Yeah.
Yes.
Reach for the phone.
Sorry.
For the microphone.
So yeah, I mean, I think that speaks to what you were saying earlier about is the science fiction about the future or is it about the present, right? The fact that so much of the golden age of science fiction was about outer space because that's what the space race was so obsessing us, and then that was where we thought the future was going, and that's what was talked about, and that's where we saw the sort of very tangible evidence of scientific progress, and now. So that is what was reflected, but now something completely different is obsessing us and stressing us out, and maybe it's advertising and the pernicious effects on the human attention span, and also things that we are really scared of. Like, I mean, I think that there's so many. I see so many zombie apocalypses, and I'm like, why are we so obsessed with the zombie apocalypse? What do we think is happening in the world around us that this is such a thing we're so concerned about and that we need to pay so much attention to? So yeah, I think that what we're seeing now is probably something that will be people on this panel 40 years from now will be able to tell you much more clearly than me what science fiction now is about.
Okay, one thing.
One thing about the near or near-ish future that Charlie, you've written about, and Kaylin, you specifically said you wanted to talk about, is of course the singularity, the point at which we can no longer predict, or can we? And I know, Charlie, you have thoughts.
The rapture of the nerds has been cancelled. No, I've got a lot of thoughts, too many to come up with and synopsize here rapidly. But let's just say, these days I'm very much a skeptic about the singularity because the whole way futurist singularitarian ideology has developed, especially the idea of mind uploading, AI heaven, simulations, and so forth, it makes me very, very nervous because I'm a nice reformed Jewish boy turned atheist. And when I see something that looks like millenarian Christian doctrine and has the same structure as millenarian Christian doctrine, just different names attached, I get very, very edgy about being asked to believe in this. And a lot of the structures of the singularity, if you deconstruct them, are identical to millenarian Christianity. It's like you have all these tech bros from Silicon Valley with engineering degrees who self-consciously rejected religion their parents grew up in, and who sort of invented their own entirely secular technology-based rationalist religion that has exactly the same built-in brain reward structures. I find this deeply suspicious, and I sort of tiptoe around it nervously.
And weirdly the same built-in misogyny.
Not necessarily. This really depends.
Quite often.
Well, okay, this really depends on where you stand. So I've had a personal experience with the singularity, if you will. 4 years ago, I was invited to be a teaching fellow, a faculty member, at a little place called Singularity University, which is not really a university and is not exclusively about the singularity, but it is a forward-thinking, forward-reaching think tank started by Dr. Ray Kurzweil, father perhaps of the modern sense of the singularity, and located at NASA Research Park in California and sponsored in part by Google. And there I had the opportunity to meet some of the people, the believers, if you will, perhaps even the missionaries of this new nerd-like religion, as you say. And I really didn't get the sense that it was a religion at all. I got the sense that the singularity, to paraphrase Mr. Gibson, the singularity is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. There are some people in the world, perhaps mostly in California, mostly in Silicon Valley, who are already enjoying autonomous vehicles and have uploaded many of their memories and their DNA to the cloud. They live life as if they are mere citizens of the United States of America, but in reality, they're more like global citizens. They travel in private jets wherever they like, whenever they like, and they live a totally different lifestyle. And it's not, you know, uploading their brains to the cloud as such, as more separating themselves from the rest of society. And I agree, it's not necessarily a positive concept.
I wonder how that fits in with Peter Thiel's idea of creating island utopias for the rich.
So here's the point, here's the point. Many of these people, while creating an entirely, or perhaps not entirely new, but a revamped millionaire lifestyle for the 21st century for themselves, are doing so by creating vast billion-dollar companies like Tesla and SpaceX that will, in turn, at some point, affect all of us. And so, whether we like it or not, whether we agree with their ideas or not, they are influential forces to be reckoned with. And their brand of singularity, or their brand of significant fundamental changes to what human society is coming. And it's not brought upon by missionaries or religion, you know, religious people or philosophers, but by venture capitalists, as you said.
Yeah, and I find this deeply disturbing. We mentioned Peter Thiel. A couple of facts about him. One is he's a really major donor to the Trump campaign. And if that's not bad enough for you, he has this interesting theory that he's putting a fair bit of money into about being able to maintain his physical, biological youth almost indefinitely by blood transfusions from young people. Did we say that? I find the idea of de facto legislation for the future for all of us by very rich billionaires with slightly dubious political or social views to be quite disturbing. Quite as disturbing as Walt Disney or Henry Ford's planned communities, where they had laws they were going to impose by which their employees had to live their lives. Only these guys are doing it on a much bigger scale by designing the architecture of the systems we live in, from the algorithms for self-driving cars used to solve the trolley problem for who they save in the event of an accident, to the social networks that are permitted to exist on Facebook. I'm not saying that government oversight would be an improvement, but libertarian billionaires are generally not the solution to social problems.
They might not be the solution we need or deserve, but that's what's happening.
Sam is reaching for the mic.
Sorry.
No, it's fine.
Why are you apologizing for my bad behavior? You see, I'm already influenced.
The question, if I understand it, is the singularity with
Yes.
a question mark, right?
Pretty much.
Okay. Oh.
Singularity, you have thoughts, go.
Okay.
This is how I wrote that down.
So for me, and as a writer and a reader, I think the reason that we're not seeing so much of the singularity in science fiction is that it's, for me, there's not so many interesting stories you can tell with it, at least as far as we understand it now. Okay, so brain uploading, living inside a computer simulation, at least from where I stand, there's like a limited number of stories, many of which have been told really well, and sort of like, what does the gray goo future look like? And that's great, but there's only so much you can do with it as far as we understand it now. So when I first found out about what the singularity was, I was like, ooh, that's amazing. I want to write a whole bunch of stories about brain uploading. And then you write one and you're like, all right, I'm good. Like, one brain uploading story, that's all I need. So you know, maybe as the singularity continues to develop and as we sort of see more transformative change, we might start to see more and more interesting figuration of that in science fiction.
Let me give you an internet story that I haven't seen yet. Fast forward the world to the year 2060. Let us posit that Facebook is as dominant of a social platform then as it is today. And because it is the current incumbent, I see no reason for it to be disrupted via a new incoming incumbent at this point. Around 2060, more than half the people on Facebook will be dead. I'd like you to imagine the implications of living in a social media environment or an artificial reality environment or a VR environment where the majority of people exist as the avatars of corpses because they've already died of old age, disease or accident, but their social media accounts are still there. In many cases there will be chatbots that partially emulate them that you can interact with. People have already attempted to make living gravestones that will show you videos of people. There are attempts underway to sort of come up with conversational bots that can sort of emulate somebody by doing deep knowledge mining of all their Twitter and Facebook postings and so for their whole life. We're going to get there. We're going to get to a point where the internet is literally haunted by ghosts, and in fact the living people of a minority.
Okay, this dovetails into a lot of stuff that's been talked about, and it's something Kevin specifically wanted to talk about, which is data. Your data. Who owns it?
Oh, so
who controls it?
Okay,
Is it yours?
Okay, not just data. Let's say that the near future, I wouldn't go as far as 2060, let's go to 2030. Okay, and Facebook has billions of zombie avatar ghosts of some of our best friends, and they're talking to us, and they're chatting, and they're sending us, oh, we became friends 20 years ago, and here's a nice picture from when we are both alive, and what? And yeah, oh, thanks for coming to my funeral, emoji. Maybe, that might be it. Who owns that person? What's the personhood of that thing? Is it part of Mark Zuckerberg's intellectual property empire? Does it belong to the heirs, the family, the people who are left behind? Is it still owned by that guy? Maybe, or girl, or person who died. Maybe I should speak to my lawyer and add to my will an element that says that all of my Twitter and Facebook and everything is to forever be bequeathed to my heirs, and then if they ever make a movie from that, they should make the money from it too. I mean, I think we're creating a lot of data, and that data is not just checking in on, well, what do the kids use these days? I don't know, Snapchat, yeah? It's a thing, right? Okay. So what the kids are doing now on Snapchat, would that be a part of the future avatar?
Well,
who owns it?
The thing about Snapchat, of course, is that it's ephemeral. Unless you take a screen cap on it,
so bad
it disappears.
Example. Bad example, not Snapchat, Instagram.
I can actually give you a precedent for this, because this sort of problem has emerged in the past. Now, I'd like to start by mentioning when you open that Facebook account or sign up with an Apple ID, there's an end-user license agreement, and hands up here who reads those things, all 96 pages of them. Ooh, I see a guy with a beard in the back row. You had to be difficult, didn't you? Nobody reads these things, but you will find that the intellectual property inherent in your interaction with a service is generally owned by the service provider, because why would they let you use their service if they didn't? Basically, one of the rules of the internet is if you're not paying for a service, you are the product. So you're also advertising. Now, where this happened before, go back to the golden age of silent movies from about 1890 to 1925. A lot of movies were made, and Hollywood accounting as it currently exists had not been invented back then. They were almost all amateur productions in terms of the scale and investment of today's terms, and rather than a company being formed that would be a shell company owning a given media product, various people would have a copyright interest in it, including the director, including the actors, including the stage groups, including all the people who participated. Now, a lot of these movies were shot on nitrocellulose film, which is closely related to gun cotton. It doesn't so much burn as explode if it ignites, and it tends to oxidize over time. And the half-life of a nitrocellulose film stock is about 50 years. So a lot of movie reels ended up being locked away in the basements of distributor houses long after the director had died and everybody but the accountants had forgotten the movie existed and it wasn't distributed anymore, until the time comes where, with the emergence of the internet and the emergence of new distribution models, people actually want to begin taking an interest in these orphaned copyright products and realize to their horror that most of the people who participated are now dead, but the material is still protected by copyright. The heirs to the actors have an interest in them, if you can find them. And in the meantime, without getting permission from all the various copyright holders, you can't transcribe the stuff onto a non-volatile medium that doesn't burst into flames when you feed it through a projector. This is actually accounting for the loss of a whole lot of old movies from the 1920s and earlier. And it's become something of an information preservation crisis among museum curators in media museums. And I can certainly see something similar happening to our social networks in future, as all the personal data either laws are passed that find that your personal data belongs to you, except you've been dead for 50 years, but it's still in copyright for another 20, and somebody related to you is the copyright owner.
So it's an orphaned work, but...
Yeah. Or, or, and most people don't make wills that address the issue of their intellectual property estate. Authors are probably an exception. But I haven't made a will yet, and I bloody ought to. The other possibility is that
incidentally, I have a sister who can. No.
Yeah, the companies will be
advertising.
Yeah, the companies will merge and be taken over repeatedly and change endlessly. And who here has or had a LiveJournal account? It's currently owned by a weird Russian company, and I haven't tried to read their end-user license agreement because I can't read Russian. But I've still got the account.
So the other interesting question for me, besides who owns our data, is who can see it, right? And I'm a community organizer in New York City, and a lot of the work that I do is around police reform and trying to change the way that the police behave, which is a lot of fun in New York City and around the world. So we're putting out all this information, much of which we don't even think twice about. Like, I'm here. Some of it we are intentionally putting out. We are tweeting where we are. Some of it we are accidentally putting out, right? You know, you go to a demonstration, the police have what they call stingrays. They are cell phone simulators. Your cell phone thinks it's a cell phone tower, so it pings its location with it. The police now have a list of everybody who was at the protest. There's all this information that is being captured. Lots of science fiction writers and journalists and folks have written about this and know much more than I do. But that's the other interesting question: is we're creating all this data. How is that going to impact work for social change, for example? You know, we've seen some of the demonstrations, folks who've been doing police reform demonstrations in New York City for a very long time, because that has been needed for a very long time, have seen that they're getting bigger and bigger, and a lot of that is because of social media, and people who you know, had never really thought about this are being inundated with the facts, and they can connect to a protest much more easily. But then there's this other fact of the data and what happens to it, and where you know, malevolent entities, whether they are police departments or governments or corporations, can get a hold of it and do with it. I mean, I don't have an answer to that question, except that there's probably some really good science fiction and fantasy to be written about it.
I'll give the slightly more positive spin on that, which is back in the 90s, when I went to demonstrations against the government, there were people taking pictures of us. You know, the government was already getting all of this documentation. It was harder, it was more manual, but they were doing it. Now, with police chest cams, with everybody having a cell phone, you know, there's a lot more transparency, and it's a lot more bidirectional.
There is no better disinfectant than the light of day. Right? And perhaps for, when was that?
Oh, that's like, I agree.
Yeah,
okay.
It's snaps.
I don't know.
Well, I just learned something new. Very cool. But
we did that in the J14 protests.
A local, so maybe Sam, maybe you don't know about this, but a couple of years ago we had this social uprising, which did nothing to change our rents, but it did get a lot of people to the streets. And it was facilitated by social media, Twitter, and so on, and by doing this as well. But my point was different. I totally forgot it now.
Okay, so
there is no better disinfectant than the light of day, right? So with the fact that we're creating so much data, we're also we also have the capacity to create data and to track the police officers.
Okay,
that we would like to,
actually, I do have a question about that. I'm going to go to the audience soon, but before that, I think a problem with the idea that there's no such disinfectant as light of day is that the information people get access to has become a lot more siloed. You know, with the number of people who thinks various insane things, I'm sorry, saying ableist, various, well, wrong things that Trump has said is fact because they read it on Breitbart or saw it on Fox. So,
I just want to just say I came to Israel to get away from him, and everyone's talking about him, so it's okay.
Sorry.
that's okay, we can talk about Brexit instead, except oops, I came to sort of forget about Brexit.
Look, we just really don't want to talk about our politics. Because, yeah, you have a potential terrible president who probably won't be elected. We've had ours for 7 years. Okay. Okay, it is time for audience questions, because we are at the hour mark.
Oh, yeah, sure.
I see, I read John Stanley's blog, and I see there a lot of comments about the split between urban and rural communities, conservatives versus progressives. Do you think this split will continue in the future, or will it change because the nature of the communities will change?
I'm not American, I'm just an interested observer of American politics. But the impression I've got is a large chunk of it is down to changing demographics in the American population in general, that up until a couple of decades ago, white, predominantly Protestant, middle-class people and working class were the majority. I should say Christian at that. These are the people who today are Donald Trump's base, and they're not the majority anymore, they're a minority. The majority throughout the United States overall is a group of, I say minorities, but I want to include women in this, and they are more than 50% of the population, but with shared interests that are not helped by the country being dominated by white middle-class males. And what we're seeing is a huge cultural backlash as a group who've been dominant for centuries lose their domination. And it's coming out everywhere in all sorts of very bizarre forms. I mean, if you're familiar with the whole Puppygate business involving the Hugo Awards, that was symptomatic. It's basically a howl of rage at the way that suddenly the Hugo voters are reading lots of stuff by women and people of color and LGBT and other minority groups and are voting for them.
And the same is true of Gamergate in the gaming industry.
Yep.
And Trump is the same phenomenon, writ large.
Exactly. So it will eventually, I'm hoping it subsides as they get used to the modern world, but I'm not convinced. And I look to Europe, where there's a migration crisis triggered by climate change and leading to wars in the Middle East, resulting in massive upsurges of racism and xenophobia and traditional right-wing authoritarian politics, and I'm not feeling optimistic about the short term.
I don't know anything about American politics, or British politics. I do have to say that I feel the concept of voting for one person or one party or two parties is entirely anachronistic, and the only thing is that we don't really have a lot of direct digital democracies.
I'd like to. We're going to do a bit of Rex at the end, but I would like to mention Malka Alder's Infomocracy as a really interesting book that deals with future politics.
What's that? I have more lighthearted question.
Lighthearted is good.
Yeah. So, getting back to Akselerandu and stuff, and a general trend in the sci-fi that has been ongoing for quite some time now, it's about sex. And Akselerandu is a really good example of that, because we have some very interesting and kinky scenes there. And what I wanted to ask, what in your opinion is a matter of its influence and importance of sex and different ways of having sex, so to speak, and sci-fi, and positioning them in the future? Like, is it important? Why is it important? Is it important or not, or just a part of whole flavor?
Well, it's really important, but I'm not sure how important.
No, yes.
You wrote the book.
Actual sexual activity is just fundamentally a side effect of being a mammal. I'm more interested in its political... and non-mammals, yeah. Yeah, I'm more interested in the social, political, and cultural side effects of the way we organize this stuff, of what we consider to be reasonably admissible behaviour in society at large and what is considered taboo or banned, and also in the way it's used to oppress people systematically. I think if we're looking at a history book in 5,000 years' time, and there's no great collapse in our level of technology back to the Stone Age before then, the 20th century will probably be remembered for two things. The period when the Anthropocene age of global warming kicked off, and the era in which human females acquired control over their own reproductive systems. And that's on a very large scale. More to the point, who benefits from being able to dictate what is and isn't acceptable behaviour in the field of sex? You can get some very nasty social stories out of this. Consider the classic would be The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood. I'm in danger of wandering off onto a tangent. I could just wibble randomly for hours on this. I'm going to shut up.
Sal wants to say it.
Yeah.
Sorry. I mean, the only thing that I would add to that, which is great, is that you know, at least as an LGBT writer, I think that writing gay sex scenes, which is something that I do from time to time, is a very radical act in many ways, because it is asserting existence that has been censored or oppressed or blocked out of the history. So at least the reason that I incorporate sex into my writing is that it's this important story that hasn't been told, and this assertion of identity, besides that's separate from the fact that sex is awesome, is that there's a way to establish oneself and one's identity.
I read fan fiction. And some of it is smutty. Yes?
Really?
Shocked.
I'm shocked to discover that there's smut going on in this AO3 establishment.
I did want to make a point, though, a serious
okay.
one. I think if you do happen to read some fan fiction, you'll see that people want to see their favorite characters enjoying sex, all kinds of different types of sex. And so there's nothing bad about it.
Especially Avengers.
Really?
So many Avengers.
That, okay? Didn't know that.
Really? The word stucky is not a word you're familiar with?
Let's just say I read different types of...
Okay.
Yeah, different universe. But here's the thing, though. It shows you that it's a way, maybe even a way for authors to get an idea of what people want to see their characters doing. And not just sexual activity. If a character, for example, a male character or a cisgender male hetero guy happens to have an entirely unhetero experience in fan fiction, and lots of people react to it, and 5,000 people, you know, give it like a retweet or whatever, then that shows you what people actually want their characters to represent. So it's a great way to get your finger on the pulse of what people want to see, not just, you know.
And what people want to see is Steve and Bucky kiss.
Yeah. That doesn't sound very, very kinky to me.
So you talked about how the current world affects sci-fi, but how do you think the current sci-fi will affect the future?
You know, on my Twitter profile, I have a couple of author bios that I rotate periodically, and one of them says, "I tell lies for money." This is just to keep me grounded. The other one is, "I abuse my imaginary friends." But "I tell lies for money" is the beginning and end of it. I try to do entertaining stuff. I get very, very bored if there's no depth to it, because writing a novel is something that takes quite a long time, months to years. So I try to put a bit more into it. And I occasionally get a bee in my bonnet and rant about development economics in secondary world fantasy, or about the right kind of fiscal arrangements for organising interstellar colonisation in a Slaven-like universe, and the second-order banking frauds that this makes possible. That doesn't mean I actually expect anyone to try and run the slow money system from Neptune's brood for real. Having said that, we can influence the future by way of influencing the people who read our work. As I mentioned earlier, Elon Musk is trying to colonize Mars and clearly grew up reading Robert Heinlein and similar. I don't think Heinlein would have actually been totally surprised by this if he was able to see this, but there are almost undoubtedly other examples of science fiction writers and science fiction designers influencing the future. Let us consider the Motorola Razr flip phone. That was directly modelled on the Star Trek communicator from the original Star Trek. And you know, it's kind of obsolete and quaint now. We've gone that far past Star Trek on communications technology. But that's one example.
It was obsolete and quaint within a year and a half.
Yeah, that's one example of science fictional imagery influencing the future. Another is Elon Musk's Dragon capsules and his plans for Mars. He's apparently issued the design contract for what the spacesuits should look like to a Hollywood set designer. Then he's going to get the engineers to actually make the spacesuits work. And you may be laughing at this, but it's what Jacques Cousteau did for his Silent World with the scuba suits. They were basically designed in fiberglass to look really cool and then shoehorn the scuba gear into them. So it is a way forward. Human beings are very responsive to myth and imagery, and it goes both ways. Finally, because misery loves company, another way things are influenced, you're familiar with the movie Alien. There is a sexual fetish subculture scene involving insemination with gelatinous alien eggs by an ovipositor-shaped dildo. I'm not making this up. I personally find it slightly bizarre because, let us face it, the movie Alien was a horror movie about male rape. And this has now gone full circle and turned into a sexual fetish.
I don't have a 10-foot pole, so I'm not touching them with anything. Yeah.
But there's some comfort in that. You should know that anybody can be somebody's fetish someday.
You were talking about advertising and the race at the bottom. Completely different subject, so we're moving away from this sex stuff. Newspapers started as just ad books that added writing, articles to get people to read the ads. And we have ad blockers coming out. Are we in a cycle? Are we in a cycle just out of equilibrium, or do you think we're really to race to the bottom? As you said earlier.
That's actually getting hyper-specific, but I think one of the side effects of ads and of spam is we tend to become immune to them. I reckon if you got somebody out of a time machine from 50 or 100 years ago and dumped them in a modern city today, they'd be reeling around with their brain blasted by the ads on every side, but we barely even notice. So this is problematical. It's
which is why the ads are getting into the content now.
Yeah, the internet advertising biz itself is in a race to the bottom. The return per ad has dropped precipitously, so do the payments per ad to the people who host them. And a lot of the ad content distribution networks that now invoke huge quantities of JavaScript that sort of conduct an auction for the eyeballs perceived on the basis of the response of the individual viewer before deciding what to serve up to them. And as often as not, it's malware, not an ad. Something to make, free porn here, click it and download a very interesting virus.
This phenomenon of malvertising, as it's known technically, by the way, is perhaps not very sexy, but it's real, and it's taking over the web advertising world. And there are new types of Trojan horses and viruses that are designed to kind of not steal your eyeballs, but trick the advertisers into thinking that you've clicked on an ad so that they can collect the money. Yeah. It's called clickjacking, and it's a serious issue, but not very sci-fi-ish at all, I think.
Can I just add as an infomercial for the audience here? If you have antivirus on your computer but you don't have an ad blocker, you need to add an ad blocker now because you're missing the complete security package. Ad blocking is a personal security issue as much as anything else.
I'm Karen Nazari and I endorse this message. Yeah, I don't have anything else to say.
That's where we're going to go to that guy there.
Okay, I would like to ask if you can elaborate a bit about how you mentioned cell phones and the internet. I found it myself a little difficult to write a convincing narrative for characters within this For example, if you know everything, you can easily go into the internet and find so many things. Conventional writing, plays with the way the way the character is revealed to information, and for me it's very difficult to write science fiction
First I'll do my usual PSA. A question is a single sentence with a question mark again. But if anyone wants to comment, specifically Charlie, I think.
Yeah, it has become very, very difficult to write near-future science fiction for largely this reason. A very good trick you can do is look at all the 1950s through 1980s crime novels where the plot would be trivially solved if one or more participants had cell phones. It doesn't often go the other way around, but there is, for example, a mainstream novel by Ian Banks, not one of his science fiction novels, called Dead Air, where the only reason the plot works, it's set in 2001, is because everybody has a cell phone. And the presence of this communications technology dictates their interactions. But those were old school dumb cell phones that you just used for SMS messaging and for voicemail and for calls. Smartphones take it to the next level up. It was said by one pundit a couple of years ago that basically smartphones today are the first truly personal computers in that they're always on the internet, they're always available. And if you sit down and do a feature-by-feature comparison of the specs of a modern iPhone or high-end Android phone with a Cray XMP supercomputer from 1980, the cell phone will kick sand in the face of a supercomputer.
Go ahead. I don't think that the future question sci-fi authors should ask themselves is about how do our characters get access to data. It should be about the veracity and the trustworthiness of that data. It should be about who controls the data. I'll give you one practical example in the show Mr. Robot, which many of you perhaps have seen. There's a point in the plot, without any spoilers, where a character looks up another character's name and comes up with a Wikipedia page describing that character as a very successful tech billionaire. And henceforth, that character decides that he should probably help this guy out because he's a billionaire and Wikipedia says so. Now, he looks like it up on his phone, but that's not detrimental to the plot. It's actually a very important point in the plot because it moves the plot forward. So to me, it's going to be about who controls the information that you get and what the stuff that we have on our phone and that we trust blindly, who put it there? That to me is a more interesting question to ask.
And whether the information is accurate or not. One science fiction novel by Ken MacLeod called The Execution Channel came out in 2008 with the shout line on the cover, "The war on terror is over, terror won." And one of the subplots involves a cell of CIA operatives whose job is locating troublesome political bloggers, killing them, and then taking over and running their blog as a disinformation source to convince all the people who are reading their conspiracy theories of something else or some alternative story. He was horrified when a couple of years later he discovered this was apparently happening in Somalia with the government, not the CIA. One can conceive, given the way that data mining is going, though, and conversational bots are developing, that rather than anything so unsubtle, we're going to hit a point in a few years' time where if a government wishes to convey a certain type of information to the public, they will rewrite web pages on the fly and serve them up through the Great Firewall of China or equivalent, rather than merely censoring them. So that rather than simply banning access to sites critical of the Chinese government, they will rewrite those sites on the fly to be less critical or positive.
This is already...
Yeah, they've certainly...
I just want to jump in there. So a couple of years ago, about 4 5 years ago, a group of hackers that you may have heard of called LulzSec exposed a company working for the federal government in Washington, D.C. And what they exposed, what they leaked, was the presentation in which this company was proposing to create such websites, to change Wikipedia articles, to do what's called as astroturfing on Twitter and other social media platforms. And again, this specific company called HB Gary Federal was shut down as a result of this massive leak and the embarrassment and the criticism. But that was 5 years ago, and nobody remembers that anymore. And there's a whole bunch of other companies doing it as we speak.
Yeah, what I'm leaning towards, though, is not something as crude as astroturfing campaigns, But you're able to profile somebody who's browsing the web and feed stuff that reinforces their own preconceptions, that's generated on the fly, basically dynamic content tailored to their expectations. Find out what conspiracy theories they believe, then selectively present evidence that supports it, rather than merely statically changing somebody's Wikipedia entry.
If I was a federal agency, I'd hire you to do that right now.
So
in fact, good job for sci-fi office.
I think it depends. Your question depends on what you're going to science fiction for, and what you, especially if you're a writer, what is exciting to you. And at least for me, the questions that I want to write about and that I want to explore are less. They're not things you can find on the internet, right? It's less about what is the GDP of this country, as like, did my son run away from home? Why did my son? Does my husband still love me? Like all these things, like the drama that makes really good fiction is in people and between people, and that is. And, I think is pretty much constant throughout human history, and that we all are anxious and fearful of the same things, and we all want the same things. And so, science fiction, no matter where it is, what you're dressing it up with, it's still going to be about those things. If it's really good fiction, if it's about really good characters.
You mentioned the ads and the other option that the society that created the internet had community transactions. How would you envision an internet with many transactions, and would it be a barrier of entry that would create a very elitist interest?
Well, in almost all cases, your access to the internet is mediated through an internet service provider, and they charge money for this service. Yeah? So all the micro-billing system would do would be to feed money that you've already paid for access to the internet back to a content provider. How you do this is the $64,000 question. Back in 1995, when we were using modems for connections, there was some estimates that you couldn't really do micro-billing with a transaction worth less than about $1 US. These days it's a different, the cost of setting up and tearing down an internet connection from end to end was a couple of minutes of modem time back then. These days, it's very different, and we do actually have micro-billing on specific services. If, for example, you have an Amazon or Apple gift card on your account, that is basically a micro-billing system, although you usually don't pay anything measured in single cents. What you would need would be some kind of larger scale thing. Call it Bitcoin.
Or I don't know if anyone here is familiar with a site called Steemit, which runs on cryptocurrency, where you get paid according to how much attention your content got, and by how much attention any particular user has in terms of power. Like a powerful user can get you paid $50 if they read your thing. And that's an actual website that exists, and I did not just invent, and that's weird.
I don't think it's weird at all. So whether it's micro-billing or anything else, if you consider that we are all creating data and consuming data all the time, and I think somebody else already said that basically data is the new oil. It's the new resource, only it's not finite, whereas oil is, and that we're already creating it all the time. The people that are going to make a lot of money are the people that are going to come up with clever ways to mine the data, serve the data, charge you for the data, or whatever aspect of data that you consume. However, again, I will make the point that I made before. There are engineers who create these algorithms, or whether they are, maybe machine learning algorithms that create other algorithms. Point being is that algorithms and engineered creatures will mediate our life. They already do, and they will mediate more and more aspects of our life. Whether we pay for it with our information, our eyeballs, our attention or Bitcoin. That's the currency that we will use to pay, but what I'm interested in is the question of who controls these algorithms. Yeah, I made a question on it.
So you talked about how current science fiction is does not try to predict the future, especially the near future.
Never has.
Yeah, but some authors do. As some recent examples are, I would say, Werner Vinge's 2006 Rainbow's End, and Charlie's own Halting State. So what are your recommendations for recent authors, if there are still any, who do try to project and predict the near future, be as the focus of their plot, or just as background detail for some unrelated plot?
Yeah, I'm going to broaden this because we are at the end, and my last question was going to be Rex of interesting near future science fiction. So you can use that specific set, but you can also go to a broader set of interesting near future science fiction that you can recommend, that you've read and you think is cool.
I'm going to pass on this question because I'm not reading enough science fiction currently. I have difficulty reading science fiction while I'm writing the stuff.
I can see why. Oh, go ahead, Sam. I'm thinking about
I should have a lot. It's like the question that you get in your head is full of answers until you get asked the question, and you're like, William Gibson's most recent book, The Peripheral, has two timelines. One is very near future, and the other is very far future, and there's a fascinating interplay between them. I think that's a really great book, but it's also one of his weakest, which like his weakest is like way better than my best. So I also will think about it.
Okay, so I'll jump in and say, and probably anybody that knows me knows that this is going to be my answer. If you want to know what's going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years, what I would personally do is go and read Neil Stephenson. And I think that, everything that he wrote, as far as I'm concerned, about the current, present, and the near future, most of it has already taken place. And I feel perhaps a little bit more prepared for the future because I've read Neil Stephenson in the past. So that's what I have to say about that.
I'm actually going to disagree on the subject of Neil Stephenson, but say he's gone a bit off the map in the past few years, but for a couple of decades, my go-to guy for insight into the near future was Bruce Sterling. In particular, his near future novels from Islands in the Net, which was 1987, through Heavy Weather, the first book I remember reading that took climate change seriously, about storm chasers in Texas after a major climate disaster, through Holy Fire, about a bioengineered future as seen through the eyes of a 100-year-old health insurance executive, through to Distraction, his novel about a presidential campaign in the 2020s, which has eerie echoes of the current one.
It's ridiculously prescient, that one.
He went on this complete tear of near-future stories set a couple of decades hence, but he basically picked topics that nobody else in SF was talking about. Oh, I forgot The Zenith Angle, his post-9/11 novel about spies, espionage, and the coming Indian hegemony. He picked these areas that nobody was really looking at and did one novel set in them, then walked away, leaving the rest of the field in the dust to pick up his leavings.
I'm currently reading a novel called The Girl in the Road by Monica Byrne, which is near future, really brilliant world building. I'm only halfway through, so it might turn out to be terrible. So, so far it's really great. And shit, I had one.
I'll do a couple. I mentioned Infomocracy by Malka Older. It's a book about a world where the world is split into groups of 100,000 people called centennials. And you vote for the government of that 100,000, and the government that has the most of those has the supermajority and basically rules the world, except for the few countries who opted out. And all the elections are run by this thing called information, which is basically an election running facility plus Google plus all of journalism. And one of the protagonists is an information operative who's basically a super spy. It's a really cool book and a really interesting look about a potential future. Another one is False Hearts by Laura Lamb. It's a really cool book about. I think it's been described as Inception meets The Matrix. You've got these twins in a world where they were Siamese twins, and they now both have artificial hearts are being split apart. And this is a world where drugs affect your dreams, and some people are stuck in their dreams. And it's also very interesting. Those are cool books that you should read.
So the one that I just thought of and then forgot is from, it's not current, but Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents, which are very interesting because they're very dark futures, and they're very dystopian. And the story is that it was supposed to be a trilogy, and Octavia Butler could not write the third book because reality had come to reflect this very dark, horrific future so much that it was not like writing fiction, it was like exploring a horrific reality, and was too emotionally damaging to go too deep into. So if you haven't read Octavia Butler, you should read all of it, but that's a great place to start.
I have a question for the audience.
Okay, quick one, we have a minute.
It's very quick, show of hands. So show of hands, how many of you believe, hope, or expect that in 10 years' time, you will still be going in meet space to a convention to hear other people talk on stage? Okay, wow, okay. Techno-optimism, good, like it. Thanks for indulging my curiosity. That was a question.
Since we are at exactly the half-hour mark, I would like at this point to thank my lovely panelists. And we would like to thank you for coming to our panel and listening, asking questions. Thank you.